So, Justine, tell me about your autistic diagnosis.
So I was formally diagnosed as autistic, I think in 2019, but I probably realised it for myself maybe a couple of years before um, my children were diagnosed. So, and it was a real revelation that I was like, oh, that makes sense. Um, and it's interesting because people kind of who haven't been through that process often think you're like, well, you're the same person as you were before. Why did it matter? And it's like, I didn't learn anything about me. All that stuff I knew already. I just didn't realise that the rest of the world wasn't like that. So once I realised the rest of the world wasn't like that and their brains didn't work like mine, it made so much more sense about the kind of struggles I'd had in interactions. So I think that's why it's actually really important. Um, and again, you kind of get that question of people saying, oh, why do you want to label? Um, and I think often people forget that there are an awful lot of labels that autists get when they're not labelled as autistic. So you can be called a diva and difficult and arrogant and standoffish and shy and just a whole bunch of labels. And I just prefer the accurate one. It's sort of, yeah, it's still a conversation that people often have, like, I don't want to label my children. Like, they are going to be labelled because we are different to the rest of, the neurotypical society. So it's important that the label that you have is the one that you've owned for yourself and that you understand what it is, and you don't think of yourself as a lesser version of this other neurotype, which you're just not.
And I say, kind of moving on from them, what have you found are the misconceptions about autism?
So many misconceptions. So first of all, I think the idea that it's something separate to us, that it needs to be cured in any way, shape or form. There's literally nothing wrong with being autistic. It's just the clash between how the world is and how our brains work. So that's often the struggle, is that what people see as autism is actually the trauma response to a world that's too hard for us. I think it's the thing that people think that as autists we overreact to the same things. So often how I try to describe it to people is that if you experience things the way we do, you would have the same reaction. So I was talking to someone the other day about why as a child in the school struggles with cross-country running, so everyone else can manage it. And I said, well, it's really cold out there. So for you, it's just really cold. But if you imagine you were running in a fridge and you had a massive fan on you, that's what they're experiencing. So the reaction you're seeing is a reaction to how we experience the world. So I think getting people to understand that it's how we experience the world and we're reacting to that is one of the hardest things. I think also when people assume that you're not autistic, they assume intentions that you don't have. So we can be very literal people. So we will say exactly what we mean, but I have learned, since I learned that I'm autistic, and also from many memes on the internet, that people say things and they mean something completely different, and then they assume that I'm doing that. So when I saw all these memes about Britishness, what British people say and what they actually mean, I looked at them and went, oh, but I've been saying those things and meaning them, and people have been thinking that I mean this other thing. So that's often where the misunderstanding is, that, generally speaking, we mean exactly what we say and we wouldn't know there's another meaning behind it. And we also assume that of other people. So people will say stuff and there's kind of some assumed language in it. And they won't know that we haven't got that undercurrent because people are so used to talking with that assumed language. So I think often when people understand those differences and accept them, those are kind of really helpful. I think getting away from the idea of a cure, that's why most of the autistic community, when there's been surveys, they prefer to be called autistic people rather than a person with autism. Generally because I can't get away from how my brain works. That's who I am. I don't call myself a person with womanhood, or a person with whiteness. That would just be weird. So the same with being autistic. I'm autistic, not a person with autism. I think it's one of those things that, because the general consensus is that identity first language, that's what that autistic person is, identity first language, is the preference, that when you're talking about the community, you want to use identity first language, but as ever, talk to the individual, because an individual might have a reason for wanting to say person with autism, and it might be, that may be perfectly valid, it may be that's where they're at in their journey. So as with all things, ask the individual. I don't think was there any other common misconceptions. Yeah.
If you just say another misconception.
So another misconception is that we lack social skills or empathy. And that's an interesting one, because it's people who aren't autistic saying, we don't relate to you very well, therefore it must be your fault, which is kind of... so there's an amazing autistic researcher called Damien Milton, who I think he was one of the first people to come up with the idea of the double empathy problem. So there was research done that found that when two neurotypical people or non-autistic people were talking together, so they tested two neurotypical people, two neurodivergent people talking together, and then from non-neurodivergent to neurodivergent. And they found, interestingly, that the most problems with rapport and communication were between when you had two different neurotypes working together. Interestingly, the best communication was between two neurodivergent people working together, which is not hard to understand because we're very direct. There's very little kind of like undercurrent, and neurotypical people talking to each other was kind of in the middle. So it's really getting that idea that it's not that we are bad at social skills. We're great, largely, at socialising with other autists when nobody's masking. There's a lovely conference once a year called Autscape, which is almost entirely autists. Neurotypicals are welcome, they just don't come that often. But there I was like, this must be what it's like when everyone communicates the way you do. And that's really lovely. So I think people understanding that we definitely don't need social skills training, because then we're being trained to be something we're not. And there are huge mental health implications around that. And that is kind of, a real problem in the autistic community, having been taught that the way we naturally are is wrong, and that being suppressed causes huge problems in later life. So we don't need social skills training, and it's a really bad idea to give us social skills training. What's really useful training is, like I said, when I was diagnosed, I found out that other people don't have brains like mine. That would have been good to know when I was a kid, as opposed to going, why don't they get, I'm just talking plainly. So what's useful is training that trains all the different neurotypes about how we all communicate, and then once we understand that, making accommodations for each other. So that's kind of really helpful. And the other thing that sometimes gets done is that we get told that we shouldn't be stimming. So stimming is self-stimulating kind of activity, so like hair twirling, or people might have fidget toys. And often people, like neurodivergent people, I'm sort of using neurodivergent and autistic interchangeably, but they are different things. Just want to acknowledge that. That's my ADHD brain doing that side thing. But often people need to do that stimming in order to concentrate. So when I do my storytelling, I will ask people what kind of listeners they are, particularly on little kids. I always say, are you a sitting still listener or a wriggle listener? So wriggle listeners need to move to listen. So I always make sure that the wriggle listeners have all their wriggle things that they need in order to listen, which is great because people have their cuddly toys and they're like, and just allowing people to do that openly, And then if people are sitting still listeners, they really need that quiet. They kind of go in the middle, so they can have their sitting still space, and the wriggle listeners have kind of space to move, so that everybody can listen together. And again, it's one of those things that because it's not seen in the neurotypical community so much, people are like, oh, you shouldn't do that, it's a bad thing, you should suppress it. But again, really bad idea to suppress it, because then we can't actually function. It's that old thing that teachers used to say about, look at me when I'm talking to you. And the thing is, if I look at somebody, then I'm not able to think anything. So it's like I can look at you, or I can not look at you, and I can listen. I wrote a chapter for a book about storytelling and special needs called The Autistic Storyteller. And one of the main points I was making is that we need to redefine what listening looks like. And if we understand that listening looks different for different people, then we're able to kind of communicate and educate across that divide. So I think those are kind of the main misconceptions that I always try to clear up in my advocacy. Or, when people are coming to when they've just discovered that they're autistic, or they've just discovered their kid's autistic, it's kind of covering off those main things. And then after that, kind of once you accept yourself and you kind of understand that you don't have to fit into a norm, it's about how do you advocate for yourself and explain that to other people. And that's the almost bigger challenge.
Wonderful. So, how does this kind of translate then into kind of a neurodiversive, what's the word, a friendly consultant?
Neurodivergent.
So you're kind of bringing in the kind of the sales pitch now. So I'll just count you in on that and you can answer.
So since I discovered I was autistic, I started kind of doing advocacy online. So I have an online Facebook page called the Autistic Circle and a blog as well, so writing about it. And because I was kind of vocal about it sort of on radio and in articles and things, I started being asked, like, can you come to my project and tell me if we're doing this right? So I've started doing consultancy around neurodivergent friendly practice. And that means like an organisation or an individual or a project will get me in and just tell me the things they're thinking of doing. Sometimes it's that they want to work specifically with neurodivergent people. Sometimes it's just that they want their project to be inclusive, so that everybody can engage. And it's really my job to listen to what they're doing and hear what they're trying to achieve and look at the places where actually this could be an issue. This could be something that would exclude a neurodivergent person, and how can we put into practice as much as possible to make sure that there is equal access for everybody, whatever their neurotype. And it can be in so many different ways. It can be going into a shop and going, well, okay, this is challenging, or this is kind of visually difficult. It can be going to a classroom, because often, particularly if you're somebody who notices lots of detail, there can be too much detail in the room for a child to be able to concentrate, And in a business, if there's kind of too many unspoken rules about how you behave in this space, then it can become inaccessible. So my job really, I'm lucky because as an autist I notice detail, which is great. So I will go in and notice those little details and feed those back to the organisation or the individual or the project to just say, maybe these are the things you need to think about. And sometimes that will be coming in the design of the project, and sometimes it'll be coming in further down the line to look at kind of the practice that has happened. So it's really just about trying to make a world that, in an environment and kind of the practices, the actual way that something's delivered, so that it's accessible to everybody, and that it isn't unconsciously sort of excluding certain neurotypes. So that's kind of a service that I offer to people. And again, that's kind of can be in person and online. It depends on the situation and what people are looking for, and it can be one-off or it can be an ongoing thing. But it's something that's I really enjoy doing, and it's really satisfying, because that if you impact that one organisation or that one project, that then kind of has a feedback not only for that project but for whatever those people do going forward. So it's really important. It's changing the world for people like me. There's a selfish side to it, that it makes things better for me and my children and kind of all the other neurodivergent people, hopefully.
Wonderful. And then I've just got the talk across the neurotypical divide. Do you think you covered that, or is that?
Yeah, it's probably worth just being a bit more specific about, I think.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've learnt by advocating is, because often I'm a neurodivergent person speaking to non-neurodivergent people, so I've had to learn to how do I communicate things in a way that neurotypical people will understand, and that's really important. I think there are certain, sometimes in advocacy we can kind of get stuck in our own community, but it's really important for autists, ADHDers, all kind of the neurodivergent community, to find a way that we can communicate across the divide and advocate for ourselves. So I hope that when I do my consultancy, I'm really looking for ways to make sure that that's getting across. And a lot of that is about how I do it. I will say, this is how I am and this is what I'm like. And if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense to you, please tell me. Which often you do have to say to neurotypical people, because they can be awfully polite and not say stuff because they think it will offend you. And I'm just like, it doesn't offend me. I like straight talking. So actually, you kind of sort out that communication up front and then just say, if this doesn't make sense, then tell me. And kind of keeping those lines of communication open and making sure that what I'm saying is coming across in the way that I want it to, and people's understanding of it is, really clear as well. So it's making that safe space where we can go, actually, we just need to talk very clearly with no assumptive language here, so that we know that we come away from this with everybody understanding, whatever your neurotype is, we're from the same page at that point, and that's really important.
Great, Justine.
Cool.
Brilliant. And then just projects.
Yeah.
So when you talk about projects,